The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1974. Eldon Marsh read it standing right there at the end of his dirt driveway, still in his work boots, still smelling of the earth he'd been turning since sunup. His hands cracked at the knuckles, dark under the nails, held the single sheet of paper without trembling, but his jaw tightened, just once. The letter was from Harlan Briggs, the operations manager at the Weston Lumber Mill, 2 miles east on Route 9. It was short, it was polite, and it was, in every way that mattered, a notice of war. Dear Mr. Marsh, please be advised that the Weston Lumber Mill will continue its current practice of depositing surplus wood byproduct materials along the eastern boundary of your property, in accordance with the informal arrangement established in 1969. Informal arrangement. That was what they called it. What Eldon called it, standing there in the gravel with the morning dew still on the grass, was something he wouldn't say out loud, not with his granddaughter watching from the porch steps. For 5 years, the mill had been dumping truckloads of sawdust, mountains of it, wet and rotting and steaming in the summer heat, right up against his back fence line, 40 feet deep in places. Yellow-white drifts of the stuff, rank as an old barn floor, stretching nearly a quarter-mile along the edge of what had once been his best cropland. And the county wasn't going to stop it, the lawyers weren't going to help him. And every neighbor he'd talked to had looked at him with that same soft, sorry expression the one people wear when they've already decided a fight is lost. Eldon Marsh was 61 years old in the spring of 1974, and he had been farming the same 127 acres outside Millhaven, Ohio, since the day his father pressed the deed into his hands and said, "Don't let it go." He hadn't. Not through the dry summer of 1953, when the corn came up stunted and yellow. Not through the flood of 1959, when the creek jumped its banks and swallowed his lower field for 3 weeks straight. Not through the years when commodity prices fell so low that men stronger and younger than him walked away from land their grandfathers had cleared by hand. Eldon stayed. He farmed the way his father had taught him, and his father before that careful, patient, and deeply respectful of the soil. He kept a team of Belgian draft horses, Buster and June, long after every other farmer in Harlan County had switched to diesel tractors. Not because he was stubborn, though some said he was, but because he understood those horses. He understood what they took from the land and what they gave back to it. A tractor compacts the soil, he'd say quietly to anyone who asked. A horse gives it back a little something every step. His equipment shed held a 1948 John Deere Model B, the 2-cylinder kind, the one the old-timers called a Poppin' Johnny for the way the engine knocked and fired in that slow, rhythmic beat. He used it for his heavier field work, though the carburetor ran rich and needed adjusting every 3rd week. He knew that carburetor the way a doctor knows a patient. His farmhouse was small and clean, white clapboard siding, a vegetable garden along the south wall that his wife Ruth tended until she passed in 1971. After that, Eldon tended it himself. Every spring he put in her same rows, tomatoes, green beans, summer squash in the same order she always had. Neighbors noticed. Nobody said anything about it. It wasn't the kind of thing you said anything about. In Millhaven, Eldon Marsh was known as a straight dealer and a quiet man. At the feed store on Maple Street, where farmers gathered on Saturday mornings over burnt coffee and the grain report, he was respected the way an old fence post is respected, not glamorous, not new, but solid, and exactly where it's supposed to be. He had 40 acres along his eastern boundary that he considered his finest ground. Deep, dark topsoil, good drainage, the kind of earth that gave back everything you put into it. He'd grown record yields of soybeans there in 1966 and 68. His neighbor, Floyd Decker, had once offered him cash money for just that parcel alone. By 1974, you couldn't farm a single row of it. The sawdust had seen to that, and the man responsible for the sawdust had never once driven down Eldon's road to look him in the eye. The dumping had started quietly, the way most bad things do. Back in the fall of 1969, a Weston lumber mill truck had pulled up to the fence line on a Wednesday afternoon while Eldon was working his north field. By the time he walked over to see what the noise was, the driver had already tilted the bed and dropped a mound of fresh sawdust, pale gold, smelling of pine right up against the wire. The driver, a young kid Eldon didn't recognize, handed him a folded slip of paper and said the mill was paying $2 a month for the use of the strip. $2. Eldon hadn't agreed to anything. He'd never signed a paper. But the kid was already climbing back into the cab, and by the time Eldon had read the slip, which was not a contract, just a notice, worded carefully by someone who knew exactly what they were doing, the truck was gone. He'd called the mill the next morning from the payphone at Hester's Diner on Route 9. He was told Mr. Briggs was unavailable. He called again the following week. Mr. Briggs was in a meeting. He drove to the mill office in November and sat in a plastic chair for 40 minutes before a secretary told him, politely but firmly, that the arrangement had been discussed with the county and was perfectly within regulation, given that the strip of land fell within an agricultural buffer zone. Buffer zone. Eldon had farmed that strip for 30 years. By 1971, the trucks were coming twice a week. The sawdust mounds had grown from knee-high to shoulder-high. In wet weather, they turned dark and matted, growing a pale gray mold on the surface that smelled like a wet cellar. In dry weather, they blew fine white dust across his field rows, coating his soybean leaves and clogging the air around his equipment. By 1973, the eastern 40 acres were effectively lost. The runoff from the sawdust piles had acidified the soil near the fence line. His yields dropped, then dropped again. And then came Harlan Briggs himself. In March of 1974, a black Ford LTD with mill plates pulled into Eldon's driveway. Harlan Briggs was 44 years old, broad-shouldered, and wore a tan sport coat on a Tuesday morning like a man who needed people to know he didn't work with his hands. He had a clipboard, a firm handshake, and the smooth, measured voice of someone who had delivered bad news before and found it easy. He told Eldon the mill was expanding operations. The sawdust volume would be increasing significantly. He was there, he said, as a courtesy, to give Eldon advance notice. "We're going to need that whole fence line, Mr. Marsh, right up to the tree row. I've spoken with county zoning and we're well within our rights." Eldon looked at him steadily. "That's my best ground back there." Briggs glanced toward the eastern field, then back at Eldon with an expression that was worse than anger. It was indifference. The flat, efficient indifference of a man who has already moved on to his next appointment in his head. "Was your best ground," he said, and he said it gently, the way you tell a child that something is simply over now. He clicked his pen, made a note on his clipboard, and got back in the Ford LTD. He didn't look back once going down the driveway. Eldon didn't fight it in court. He didn't put a sign in his yard. He didn't call the county again. What he did, on a cool Monday morning in April of 1974, was back his old John Deere Model B up to the nearest sawdust pile, hook up his single-bottom plow, and start moving material. His neighbor, Floyd Decker, saw him from across the fence line around 8 in the morning and walked over, coffee thermos in hand, watching with the careful squint of a man trying to make sense of something that doesn't quite add up. "Eldon," Floyd said slowly, "what in the Sam Hill are you doing?" "Working," Eldon said. "Working," Floyd repeated. He looked at the mountain of gray-brown sawdust. He looked at the old two-cylinder John Deere. He looked at Eldon's face, which offered nothing further. "You're gonna move all of it?" Not move it, Eldon said. Turn it. Floyd stood there a moment longer, thermos halfway to his lips. Then he shook his head, slowly, not unkindly, but with the resignation of a man watching someone do something he is fairly certain won't work. Eldon, he said quietly, that's sawdust. You can't farm sawdust. Not yet, Eldon said, and he put the tractor in gear. Floyd watched him for another minute. Then he walked back to his own farm, and that was that. By the second week of April, word had gotten around Millhaven, the way word always gets around small towns, not through any one conversation, but through the accumulation of small observations passed between people at the feed store, the diner, the co-op on Birch Street. Old Eldon Marsh was out there working those sawdust piles. Some people thought he'd finally gone soft in the head after Ruth died. Others thought maybe he was just keeping busy, that a man like Eldon couldn't sit still, and sometimes doing something foolish was better than doing nothing at all. A few younger farmers drove slowly past on Route 9 just to look. Some of them laughed. Not cruel laughter, exactly, but the easy, careless laughter of men who are certain they understand something that someone else doesn't. Harlan Briggs heard about it too. He heard about it at the Millhaven Rotary Club luncheon on a Thursday in late April from a county zoning officer named Pete Garland, who thought it was a funny story. Briggs listened, cut a piece of his pork roast, and smiled. He's composting it, Briggs said, like a man identifying a mildly amusing species of bird. I had an uncle who composted. Lovely hobby. He took a bite. Of course, my uncle didn't try to do it across 40 acres with a 30-year-old tractor. The table laughed. Briggs let it settle, then added still pleasantly, still with that smooth, unhurried voice. Sawdust takes nitrogen right out of the soil when it breaks down. Every extension agent in Ohio will tell you that. The man is making his ground worse, not better. But I suppose when you've lost something, you've got to feel like you're doing something about it. He picked up his water glass. Bless his heart. Back on the farm, Eldon heard none of this, or if he did through Floyd, through the occasional stiffness in a conversation at the feed store, he gave no sign of it. He worked 6 days a week, sunup to past noon, then again in the late afternoon when the heat broke. His granddaughter Lily, who was 13 and spent her summers with him, sometimes brought him a jar of cold water and a biscuit wrapped in a cloth at mid-morning. She would stand and watch him work the slow back and forth of the tractor, the methodical turning and layering, and one morning she asked him the same question Floyd had asked. "Grandpa, are people saying bad things about what you're doing?" Eldon shut the tractor down and took the water jar. He drank half of it before he answered. "Probably," he said. "Does it bother you?" He looked out across the rows of turned material, dark and steaming faintly in the morning cool, and was quiet for a long moment. "Lily," he finally said, "the ground doesn't care what anybody says about it. It just does what it does. I figure I ought to be the same way." He handed her back the jar, started the tractor, and went back to work. Lily stood there, watching him, this thin, steady old man on his knocking, smoke-trailing John Deere, and something settled in her chest that she wouldn't have words for until she was much older. It was the particular feeling of watching someone refuse to be small, even when the whole world is doing its level best to make them feel that way. The sawdust piles stretched along the fence line as far as she could see, and her grandfather worked every single one of them. The first thing Eldon did was go to the library. Not the internet, not a university extension office, though he'd eventually write them a letter too. He drove his 1966 Ford F-100 pickup, faded green, one working headlight, a crack in the passenger window sealed with electrical tape, into Millhaven on a Thursday morning, and sat at a table in the Harlan County Public Library for 3 hours with 4 books spread open in front of him. He wasn't starting from nothing. He'd composted kitchen scraps and barn waste his whole farming life, every good farmer did. But what he was attempting now was different, bigger, more complicated. And the specific problem with sawdust, he knew, was the one Harlan Briggs had named correctly at that Rotary luncheon, even if Briggs had meant it as a dismissal rather than a diagnosis. Sawdust is carbon, pure, dense, stubborn carbon. When you work raw sawdust into soil and it begins to break down, the microbes doing that work consume nitrogen voraciously, pulling it right out of the surrounding earth, starving whatever crops you try to grow. Farmers called it nitrogen drawdown, and it could sterilize a field for years if you handled it wrong. Eldon had known this since he was 20 years old, which is exactly why he wasn't going to work it into the soil raw. He was going to compost it first, fully, properly. Turn that carbon into something balanced and alive before a single shovelful touched his field. And to do that, he needed three things in careful proportion: nitrogen to feed the process, moisture to sustain it, and oxygen to keep it from going dead and sour. He had a plan for all three. For nitrogen, Eldon had the best source a farmer could ask for: his own barn. He kept 12 head of cattle and a small flock of laying hens, and what they produced in a season was considerable. He'd always composted his manure, but modestly, in a single pile behind the barn. Now he began collecting every bit of it: cattle, manure, chicken droppings, even the urine-soaked straw bedding from the stalls, and hauling it by the bucket and the barrow out to the fence line. The ratio he was working toward, based on what he'd read and what his own instincts told him, was roughly 25 parts sawdust carbon to 1 part nitrogen-rich manure. Not exact. Composting wasn't chemistry class, but close enough to get the pile heating. He layered it like a cake. 8 inches of sawdust, 2 inches of manure and soiled bedding, 8 inches of sawdust, 2 inches of manure. He worked from the southernmost pile northward, one section at a time, Buster and June hauling the loaded manure cart, while the John Deere handled the heavier turning and shaping. By the end of the first week of May, he had 4 piles running, each one roughly 30 feet long, 6 feet wide, and 4 feet high. He marked each one with a short cedar stake and a strip of cloth torn from an old feed sack, and he dated each stake with a grease pencil. Then he waited and watched. On the third morning after building the first pile, Eldon drove a length of old metal pipe, a leftover piece of half-inch galvanized he'd had in the equipment shed for a decade, down into the center of the mound. He left it there for 2 minutes. Then he pulled it out and pressed the back of his wrist against the end of the pipe. It was hot. Not warm, hot. The way a fever is hot. He allowed himself a single small nod. Then he went to build the next pile. A compost pile that heats properly, he knew, could reach temperatures of 140, even 160 degrees Fahrenheit deep in its core. That heat was everything. It meant the microbial population had taken hold, that billions of invisible organisms were eating through the carbon and nitrogen, breaking molecular bonds, converting raw waste into something the soil could actually use. It also meant the pile was killing weed seeds and pathogens, cleaning itself from the inside out. But heat alone wasn't enough. A pile that heats must also breathe. Every 10 days, Eldon turned each pile. This was the hardest work of the entire operation, and there was no way to make it easy. He used the tractor when he could, the Model B with a homemade turning attachment he'd welded together himself from a set of old cultivator shanks and a length of angle iron. But the inside of each pile had to be brought to the outside, and the outside folded back in, and that meant handwork. A long-handled fork, his back, his arms. The slow, steaming labor of a man standing in the middle of a mound of decomposing material in July heat, turning it section by section while the sweat ran into his eyes. On the first turning of pile number 2, in late May, He hit a dead zone, a section in the middle where the material had gone anaerobic, turned slimy and gray-black, smelling of ammonia sharp enough to sting his eyes. He'd packed it too dense in one spot, not enough air getting through. He didn't curse. He spread the dead section out, let it dry in the sun for an afternoon, added a thin layer of dry straw from the barn to loosen the texture, and rebuilt it. 3 days later, the pipe test showed heat again. Small setback. Noted. Corrected. Move on. Moisture was the third variable, and in the summer of 1974, it became the most stubborn one. June turned dry in Harlan County. Then July turned drier. The creek that ran along Eldon's south property line dropped to a trickle by the 4th of July. And the piles, which needed to stay damp as a wrung-out sponge to keep their biological activity going, began to dry out and go quiet. Eldon hauled water. He had a 250-gallon galvanized stock tank mounted on the bed of the F-100, and he filled it from his well twice a day during the dry stretch and drove the fence line slowly, soaking each pile from the top with a length of garden hose. It took him 90 minutes each run. He did it every morning and every evening for 6 weeks straight. His granddaughter, Lily, helped on weekends, riding in the truck bed and holding the hose while Eldon drove at a walking pace. She stopped asking questions about what he was doing somewhere in the middle of July. She just helped. Some lessons, Eldon had always believed, are better caught than taught. By August, something was changing. The first 4 piles had been turning for 3 months. When Eldon drove his pipe into their centers now, the heat had moderated, not the fierce, sharp fever of a new pile, but a steady, deep warmth. The material had shrunk to roughly half its original volume. The color had shifted from pale yellow-gray to a deep, rich brown, almost black in the center sections. And the smell had changed entirely. Raw sawdust smells sharp and resinous. Manure smells like what it is. But this smelled like a forest floor after rain, dark and clean and alive. Eldon took a handful from the center of pile number 1, squeezed it in his fist, opened his hand, and looked at it. It crumbled apart slowly, loose and granular. No trace of the original sawdust structure. No strings or fibers. Just fine, dark, broken down organic matter. He stood there for a long moment in the August heat. This 61-year-old man with a bad left knee and grease permanently under his fingernails, holding a handful of something that 6 months ago had been industrial waste. He thought about Harlan Briggs in his tan sport coat. He thought about Floyd Decker shaking his head at the fence line. He put the handful back on the pile, dusted his palm on his dungarees, and walked back to build the next row. He had 36 more piles to go. It took 3 years. Not 3 weeks. Not 1 growing season. 3 full years of hauling and turning and watering and waiting before Eldon Marsh spread the first finished compost across his eastern field. Some people hear that and think it sounds like defeat stretched out over time. Eldon thought it sounded exactly right. Good soil isn't made in a hurry. It never has been. By the fall of 1976, he had worked through every pile along the fence line. 42 piles in total. Some had taken 4 months to finish properly. A few of the larger, wetter ones had taken closer to 7. He'd kept a small notebook, a dime store composition book with a mottled black and white cover where he recorded the date each pile was started, the materials used, the turning schedule, and the date he judged it finished. The notebook had dirt on every page, and the spine was held together with a rubber band by the end. In October of 1976, he borrowed Floyd Decker's broadcast spreader. Floyd lent it without asking questions, which was its own kind of apology, and began incorporating the finished compost into the eastern 40 acres, working it in with the Model B and a set of disc harrows. He went over each section twice, Then he let it sit through the winter. He planted soybeans in May of 1977. That summer was a good one in Harlan County. Warm nights, decent rain, nothing catastrophic. But what happened on Eldon's Eastern 40 was not simply the result of a good summer. By late June, Floyd Decker was standing at the fence line again. Same spot as 3 years earlier. No coffee thermos this time. Just standing, looking, with his hands in his back pockets and his head tilted slightly to one side. The soybeans were extraordinary. Not good, not promising, extraordinary. The kind of stand that makes a farmer stop walking and just look for a minute because he needs to make sure he's seeing what he thinks he's seeing. Deep green, uniform, dense plants that had clearly found something rich and deep to root into. While Floyd's own beans in the adjacent field showed the pale, slightly stressed color of plants working hard in ordinary ground, Eldon's Eastern 40 looked like a photograph from an agricultural college textbook. Floyd pulled a plant from near the fence row gently, with permission from no one, the way farmers do, and looked at the root system. It was extraordinary, too. White and branching and extensive, threaded through soil that crumbled dark and loose between his fingers. He stood there a long time. When Eldon came around on the tractor that afternoon, Floyd flagged him down. "Eldon," he said. He stopped, started again. What did you—" He held up the root ball, almost helplessly. Eldon looked at it. Then he looked at Floyd. "Compost," he said simply. Floyd nodded slowly, looking back at the field. "I'll be damned," he said quietly, not laughing now, not shaking his head. Just standing there with the honest, uncomplicated expression of a man who has been shown something true. Word travels fast in a small county when the thing traveling is a 40-acre soybean field that looks like nothing anyone has seen in 20 years. By August, farmers were driving past on Route 9 the same way they had driven past 3 years earlier, slowly, looking, but the mood was different now. The windows came down. Men leaned out and looked for a long time before driving on. A few stopped and knocked on Eldon's door. He showed them all the same thing, walked them to the field, let them pull a plant if they wanted, answered their questions in his quiet, unhurried way. He didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't mention the years of early mornings and hauled water and the dead zones he'd had to rebuild. He just showed them the soil dark and crumbling and alive, and let it speak for itself. When the yield numbers came in that fall, Eldon Marsh's Eastern 40 produced 51 bushels of soybeans per acre. The Harlan County average that year was 31. The county extension agent, a young man named Gerald Foss who had been on the job less than 2 years, drove out to the farm in September with a notepad and spent 2 hours with Eldon walking the field and taking soil samples. His report, filed with the Ohio State University Agricultural Extension Program in Columbus, described the compost-amended soil as having organic matter content nearly 3 times the county average and a microbial activity level that Foss called, in his careful bureaucratic language, exceptional for the region. Harlan Briggs heard about it. He heard about it the same way he'd heard about the composting through the Rotary Club, through Pete Garland, through the general low current of county conversation. And this time, when his name came up in relation to Eldon Marsh's field, it was not with amusement. He drove out to Route 9 on a Saturday morning in October. Alone this time. No clipboard, no tan sport coat, just a man in a plain jacket, parked on the gravel shoulder of the road, looking through the fence at a field of harvested soybean stubble, ground that had been buried under his mill's waste for 5 years and had come back stronger than it had ever been. He sat in that car for a long time. Nobody saw him leave. In the spring of 1978, a letter arrived at Eldon Marsh's farmhouse on Route 9. He read it at the kitchen table this time. Coffee at his elbow, morning light coming through the window Ruth had always kept clean. It was from Harlan Briggs. Not from the mill's legal department, not from a secretary, from Harlan Briggs himself, written in the slightly stiff, careful hand of a man who doesn't write personal letters often and knows it. He said the mill was changing its waste disposal practices, a new arrangement with a landfill operation 2 counties over. The dumping along Eldon's fence line would stop completely by June. He also said, and this was the part Eldon read twice, that he had spoken with Gerald Foss at the extension office, that he understood now what had been done with the material his mill had deposited, that he found it, and he used this word deliberately, remarkable. He did not say he was sorry. Men like Harlan Briggs in 1978 did not often say that word on paper. But the letter existed. He had written it and signed it and mailed it. Eldon understood what that cost a man like that, and he respected it in his quiet way. He wrote back a single paragraph, thanked Briggs for the notice, said the ground was doing well, said if the mill ever had questions about what to do with its sawdust going forward, he was happy to talk. He meant it sincerely. That was the thing about Eldon Marsh, that the people who laughed at him never quite understood he had never been at war with anyone. He had simply been taking care of his land. Lily Marsh grew up and went to Ohio State. She studied soil science. She said later that she chose it because of those summer mornings on the back of her grandfather's pickup, holding a garden hose over a pile of composting sawdust, watching a quiet old man refuse to quit. Eldon farmed his Eastern 40 until he was 74 years old. The soil he built from that industrial waste, that mountain of discarded material that everyone said was worthless, never stopped giving. He used to say, in his plain, unhurried way, that he hadn't done anything remarkable at all. I just paid attention to what the ground was trying to tell me, he'd say. Most people walk right over the answer to their problems every day. They just never look down.